A year or so ago, the Metropolitan Police were published in the press as having another criminal officer, and it's reported he was in the same unit as disgraced murderer Wayne Couzens, who killed Sarah Everett in 2020. This is the case of Garry Weddell, a much less reported on disgraced Met officer who murdered his wife and his mother-in-law. Garry Weddell was born in Tyneside, and there isn't much which is easy to find in the public domain about his early life, or in fact anything other than murders which he committed. We do know from newspaper reports he grew up in Newcastle's West End on the streets of Ellswick, and his birth notice from 1960, which was placed in the Chronicle, reads he was born on Friday, June 24th at 135 Northbourne Street. Today the Northbourne Street address no longer exists, as nearly every single house on the road has been torn down to make way for new developments. His mother reportedly ran a grocery shop and his father was a teacher. Accounts from those who went to school with him at Atkinson Road Primary School in Benwell before moving to the John Marley Lower then Upper School say he was a canny or a funny lad. An old school friend spoke to a local paper about how Garry wanted to join the army and he'd bring guns into school. He said he'd go into the far corner of a field and play with his air guns with a few friends, and sometimes he'd go along and watch them. In 1976, Garry Weddell joined the army, and in 1985 he married his wife, Sandra J. Khan, and they had 3 children together. Sandra Weddell was a 44-year-old nurse from Bedfordshire, England, who was also an exam invigilator. She was said to be a kind and very religious woman, and he was an inspector in the Metropolitan Police who had more than 25 years' service and was also a Police Federation rep based in Barnet, North London. It's said, although I haven't found any confirmation of this, that in 2006 Sandra Weddell was discovered by Garry as to having an affair, and it's also said that this prompted a very real fear that she'd leave him and take their children with her. In January 2007, Garry is said to have put a cable tie around his wife's neck, strangling her, and then tried to make it look like a suicide, and a letter was left nearby as though Sandra had written it. Despite some inconsistencies in the initial investigation, Weddell was not arrested, and when colleagues and neighbours were questioned regarding the day Sandra died, her colleagues had said she was behaving perfectly normally, and the only odd element was that neither she nor Garry picked the children up from school. Garry also, despite being in the Metropolitan Police, asked his neighbour for help finding Sandra, as he claimed that she'd been missing for 24 hours. There were of course some detectives on the case who did not believe that Sandra's death was a suicide, and continued looking at it without Weddell knowing. He was arrested on his doorstep for his wife's murder 6 months later. The now late John Olson reviewed the suicide. He was a linguist, and at first he could not envisage a police inspector killing his own wife. And on further analysis, John concluded after reading the notes over and over and over again that it was most likely not Sandra who would have penned the letter, because Garry always used the full stop after his salutation, and she didn't. His sentence structure was too short compared with Sandra's, and he ended the letter with her full name. So this case led to debates and I believe changes in the law regarding bail, because the tragedy doesn't end here. Garry was granted bail on the condition of £200,000 was paid to secure his release, and this was paid by his brother. An agreement to live with his brother and not have contact with witnesses or enter Bedfordshire County, not have contact with his children, unless it was arranged with their consent. Sandra's mother was Danish born. Her name was Trouter Maxfield, and she was to be Garry's next victim. Whilst on bail for murder, Garry took up clay pigeon shooting lessons, and on Friday the 11th of January 2008, his brother noticed a large holdall in Garry's car, and then on January the 12th, the Saturday 2008, he failed to alert anyone that his brother's bed was empty and he'd not slept in it. And of course this was one of the bail conditions, that he stayed at this house. He wasn't allowed to sleep somewhere else. Weddell had feared that Sandra's family giving evidence against him took a shotgun to Sandra's mother's house and shot her to death. Trouter Maxfield was 70 years old when she was murdered, and it was she who had joint custody of Garry and Sandra's children with a sister-in-law, whilst he was not allowed to have them live with him. It was reported that in fact this 70-year-old lady insisted on being a key witness against him at the trial, and her friends reportedly said that she was absolutely terrified that he would come after her. It's also said that he may have been on his way to kill his sister-in-law and other family members. At the inquest, a detective chief inspector said that the investigation team believed that Garry Weddell was possibly en route to carry out another attack, but he'd been worried about a helicopter overhead. In any event, he killed himself with his stolen shotgun in a field 10 miles away by Broomhill Shooting Club in Markyate, where he walked up a lane and shot himself dead. A lot was made of the decision to allow Weddell bail, and whilst researching for this video, there was not an easily found balanced supply of information. In truth, if it was my mother who'd been murdered because this man was free to go and do so, I'd be angry and not very understanding or forgiving. And the children of Trouter, I have to say, have handled themselves with great grace and a very balanced approach. It doesn't seem widely reported on that the judge in fact refused bail initially, twice. The Crown had argued that the concern was that Weddell could abscond or interfere with the prosecution witnesses. Also, when he was interviewed by police, Weddell was found to have the cable from a TV aerial hidden in his sock, and he told officers, "I just wanted to go to sleep." After this statement, a psychiatrist interviewed Weddell, and he found no evidence of a psychotic disorder and ruled he was not a suicide risk. The accused policeman told the expert he only intended to use the TV aerial wire to make a ball to occupy himself. The Crown's case was that Weddell killed his wife to retain control, because his family life, which was very comfortable for him, was under threat when Sandra decided to leave him. At 27th of July bail hearing 2007, the judge made it clear it was a borderline decision to release Garry Weddell on 8 conditions, including the £200,000 surety put up by his brother, surrendering his passport, living with his brother in Woking, Surrey, not contacting any of his children without their consent, and only entering Bedfordshire to attend court or for approved meetings with his children, and should he breach these, he would go straight to jail. The judge did note that the Crown had a circumstantial case of reasonable strength, however, based on Weddell being undoubtedly a professional man with strong roots, made the hard decision to grant bail. On the 2nd of January 2007, Weddell was accused of speaking to a prosecution witness he was banned from contacting. This was his children's guardian, and for going to a pub in Bedfordshire, which he was prohibited from entering the county. The magistrates found that the second breach was proved, but allowed him to remain on bail because it was so minor. The prosecution opposed bail at every stage. Conservative MP from Hamel Hempstead, where Weddell's body was found, called for a change in the law to make bail more difficult in such serious cases. Both the judge and the psychiatrist have been somewhat eaten alive by the press, and my own opinion is that given his role as a police officer, he should have been held to account the moment he breached bail and held in custody until trial. I believe Judge Bevan acted fairly initially, granting bail, as he had refused it twice before, and although the Crown had a case of reasonable strength, it was described as circumstantial, and there were factors perhaps, such as him being in custody as a police officer. He would be high risk, and should he have been killed, the family would have been denied justice, and some may have actually still believed his innocence. That said, Paul Kahn, the son of Trouter Maxfield and brother of Sandra Weddell, has made some excellent points which have been published in Parliament. He commented that one who's committed an offence is no better than one who is from a less privileged position in society, and a murderer who is wealthy and respected is no better than a murderer from an underprivileged position. He goes on to say that Weddell used the restricted time element and play it as we go approach to eliminate the opportunity for careful thinking and evaluation. In Weddell's case, the CPS did not have a copy of the psychiatric report, which had only been completed just before the court. The requirement to give bail goes against police evidence and presents the judge a difficult task in refusing bail. He mentions that the psychiatrist was not familiar with all aspects of Weddell's personality. It's likely the psychiatrist was biased. After all, he's paid by the defendant for the report, and he would have been instructed as to what was required. In fact, the psychiatrist used Garry Weddell's own words in his report as an explanation for the stolen coaxial cable. He mentions that Judge Bevan should not have taken the word of the psychiatrist based on what he'd heard. In fact, Judge Bevan was lied to, misled by Weddell in court, and Judge Bevan was aware of this. as he'd raised a concern in his mind but decided to press on regardless. Of course, the problem is we can never have a bail system that's not flawed. The police are not beyond reproach, and it's their evidence which puts innocent people in prison sometimes. We all understand the saying of people are innocent until they are proven guilty, and the courts must deal in fact, and before the trial, many facts will not be heard. The following I'm just going to read out there is published on beds.police.uk, Male Violence Against Women and Girls, and is written by PCSO Rachel Khan, who lost a sister and mother-in-law. So she's the sister-in-law to Sandra Weddell. Rachel has published that Garry was charming, but he was dangerous, a wolf in sheep's clothing. When I first met him, he came across as very engaging, thoughtful, considerate and charismatic, and in fact most people thought the same. But even from the start, something in my stomach didn't quite feel right. Over time, I started noticing his behaviour, and he'd often lie, change his stories, and when questioned, he'd laugh it off. He would often pit friends and family against each other and create barriers between people. With confidence in his approach, he would make you doubt yourself, your own gut instinct, and even doubt others around you. If you questioned him, he would turn it around, and you would leave questioning yourself instead. After more than 20 years of marriage, Sandra got the courage and discussed a plan to leave him. She was going to buy her own flat with the money from an endowment policy, then eventually get a divorce and start a new life for herself. However, with the breakdown of the marriage, Garry realised he was losing control. In a bid to regain it, he wanted to take the ultimate price, Sandra's life. He planned to murder Sandra, and with a well thought out plan, he wanted to make it look like a suicide. For months, Garry would contact friends and family and act concerned about her well-being, asking them to check in on her, feeding people with false information, even going as far as contacting her GP, claiming to be worried about her. At the time, he was working as a police inspector and a school governor, so people had little reason to doubt his motives. As people grew concerned for Sandra, his confidence grew again, as everyone believed he was a hero, doing a good deed to protect her. I mean, who wouldn't trust a man that seemed to be so worried about his wife? In January 2007, Sandra was found dead in the garage at her home address, and 6 months later, Garry was arrested for the murder after detectives analysed the suicide note. At court, he was able to convince the judge, as well as friends and family, that he was an upstanding member of society, a loving father, and someone who was genuinely concerned for his wife, and he was subsequently released on bail. As part of his bail conditions, his children were not permitted to live with him, and custody was granted to myself and the granny traughter. He also knew she would be given evidence against him in court. Garry realised he was running out of excuses with more and more evidence coming to light. He knew that time was ticking, he was losing control, and when he would inevitably be sentenced, he would be in prison for the rest of his life. In January 2008, he shot and killed his mother-in-law. He also planned to kill me and maybe others, but thankfully he got spooked. He was scared of going to prison, didn't want to face the consequences of his action, and he went on to kill himself. But his controlling behaviour didn't stop there. At his funeral, he had a speech read out, which he wrote himself, talking about how much of a loving husband and father he was, and how much of a hero he was as part of his job. The devastation his actions caused spilled out for many years. There were mental health issues, job losses, marriage breakdowns. This was truly an awful time for everyone involved. As I look back, I was determined I would not let him ruin my life or the children's lives. He will not have that power. I will speak out and share my story, and I will encourage people to always trust your gut instincts. If something doesn't seem right, there's a reason. Garry played a clever game, and he knew what he was doing. There are several red flags within this case that are easily missed if you're in that situation. Rachel notes a gut feeling, and often we ignore this. And gut feelings or intuitions occur when your brain makes a substantial match or mismatch between past experience and current experience. What we are noticing are patterns based on past experience that we store and associated information as long-term memory, and then retrieve the information when we see these patterns again or in our everyday experience. Given that Rachel's a PSCO, this would probably make sense. So if you're looking for cues that someone's untruthful, you rarely find them in their conscious actions and their words. And you can get cues from vibes they're giving off and their body language. But it can't be consciously picked up, but it will be by those deeper animal parts in our brains that evolve to quickly judge a character under duress. People who lie often think they're good at doing the lying, but the body often betrays us, and it speaks by giving off micro-expressions. We don't always spot these subtle cues. We don't always immediately know that we've spotted them, but our gut does. If you have a gut feeling a person is deceptive or lying, there's generally a good chance that you're right. Narcissists are generally to be avoided because of many studies that show that the love and the kindness to others is often a mimic of something that they've seen. The hallmarks of narcissistic personality disorder are grandiosity, a lack of empathy for people, and a need for admiration. People with this condition are frequently described as arrogant, self-centred, manipulative and demanding. And whilst people who worked with Garry Weddell were shocked when he was arrested and always seemed a good bloke, it's clear from those who knew him in a non-work setting that there was a more destructive side to him. Rachel may be describing a version of narcissistic gaslighting. It's an effective means to gain control, and it may be said that having uniform jobs, being in the army and the police, automatically provides a controlling environment. In particular, the police have more power than civilians and can legally lock you up, stop and search you and carry weapons, even if it's just a baton. Some studies suggest that the police force has the highest instances of domestic abuse, with around 40% of families of officers being subject to stalking, violence or homicide. Narcissists can take the higher ground by never admitting when they're in the wrong. Garry immediately makes clear in the suicide note that he wrote on behalf of Sandra that he is the injured party. He talks of his own hurt, betrayal, stupidity, and how kind he is to want to forgive her. And in my opinion, this is placing him as the victim and requesting sympathy, taking any of his wrongs off the table. They can make you feel bad about yourself. We do not have specific details, but Rachel mentions that he would often pit friends and family against each other, create barriers between people with confidence, and he'd make you doubt yourself, your own gut instinct, and even doubt others around you. Narcissists can convince other people that you're in the wrong. For months, Garry would contact friends and family and act concerned about well-being. Gaslighting fits with their capacity for lying, and it's also an effective way to attack the core of who you are, potentially making you more willing to do what the narcissist wants you to do and become dependent on them. Although Sandra was established with her own important profession of nursing, this sounds realistic, as she did need the courage to leave him. Of course, gaslighting can be caused by other factors than narcissism, such as learnt behaviour, fear-based response due to abandonment issues or conflict avoidance. But the fact he even wrote his own funeral speech congratulating himself on being a hero, loving father and husband just highlights his self-entitled, self-important view of himself. It's not apparent that he has empathy for his own children, who he has made orphans, who he was so scared of losing if his wife left him. And I believe this is another control tactic, and he felt he was expected to want his children with him as a good father. He fails to recognise or even care that as Trouter's husband had died, he made her children orphans as well. The most important thing to Garry Weddell, in my opinion, was to garner sympathy from his wife's death and destroy her reputation in the process, stoically carrying on as a grieving hero. When this wasn't possible, his mission was to kill anyone who could tell the truth about the real Garry Weddell. In my opinion, the real Garry Weddell is an insecure little boy without emotional intelligence who relies on others to stroke his overinflated and not really earned ego. He didn't know how to conduct loving relationships, had to be the centre of attention, entertaining himself via destruction and belittling those in his personal life, and possibly even those he arrested. I did go to the house where the Weddells lived, and there have been modifications, so it looks quite different to the ones that are available online, so I'm not going to show a photo. Unfortunately, there's no public record I could find with a location of burial or ashes, so I've planted a flower for Sandra and Trouter.